Okay, so Mark Allers is the Vice President of Business Development at Cimcor. At Cimcor, Mark drives strategic focus and alignment with industry initiatives and strategic partnerships. During his tenure in executive management roles at numerous enterprise software companies and a venture capitalist firm, he has focused on software security and enterprise management. Thanks for presenting today, Mark. We're looking forward to hearing about industry's critical role, or integrity's critical role within NIST 800-207 and Zero Trust.
Thank you. I'm going to try sharing my screen here real quick. My name is Mark Allers. I'm Vice President of Business Development at Cimcor. I want to thank CMU and the Software Engineering Institute for having me. This is my second year presenting. My goal is pretty simple. It's to further educate audiences on Zero Trust and Zero Trust architectures, the requirements that are not specific to authentication and authorization. So 2 years ago, I gave my presentation, and General Tuhill asked me to meet him the following morning and relative to comments on my presentation, and asked him if I needed to prepare for anything. He said, nope, just have a few comments. And the comment that stuck with me is that he said, we're going to solve this problem through Zero Trust. He has no issues or problems relative to the hardware component or the software component, but he said the one big thing that is daunting to him is this thing called wetware. And never heard that term wetware until we spoke. And the wetware issue is the human element. And he said, Mark, one of the wetware considerations to solve this problem is very specific to integrity. So that leads me into a few comments before we kick this off. Comment number one, today's topic is going to focus on integrity. So if I ask, everyone on this call, or if I ask 50 people their definition of integrity, I'm going to give 50 different answers. When we consider the SANS-CIA triad, the C and the A are very well defined, but the I is not, and it has not been for decades. So we're gonna kind of touch on that here today. Number two, I'm going to stay away from a product pitch other than making one statement of who Cimcor and Cimtrack is. Cimcor is the company. Cimtrack provides an integrity suite platform. It detects unwanted, unexpected, and unauthorized changes, both malicious and or circumvented, in real time to critical IT infrastructure, and provides a path to remediate and rollback to create a trusted, secure, and resilient infrastructure. When we talk about rollback, we're not talking about reprovisioning. We're talking about rollback to baseline, because baseline is one of the key components of integrity controls. Number three, integrity controls applies to both cloud and on-prem, which we'll discuss here today. Number four, ZT and ZTA does not apply to every security solution that's out there. For those that were at RSA last week, there's over 1,000 vendors that were there. And, almost 60-70% of those vendors are all touting solutions relative to Zero Trust. And I would give one question. I said, what pillar would you guys align yourselves to? And I either got deer in the headlights, which is 70% of the folks that I spoke to, or 30 are like, wow, that's a good question. Are you referring to 800-207? So I can definitely say, feedback from RSAs that most of the stuff that we're seeing there is all marketing hype. Comment number five, integrity applies to both IT and OT, which we'll discuss here today. And number six, think of integrity as the immune system to the human body. It's not the brain, it's not the eyes, it's the immune system. It's the leading indicator that we have a health issue. And I'll explain that here today as well. And today's presentation that I'm giving is broken into three parts. Part one is integrity. Part two is the scenario specific to the secluded Semiconductor Inc. Scenario. And part three is I will walk through a couple demos and snippets, very apropos and relevant to the today's conversation. So let's do a quick little level set here. So the current administration has executed 14028. That's the kind of the leading charge for everything. Zero trust architecture means the entire end-to-end approach to build, configure, deliver, and maintain security solutions that minimizes breaches and confidentiality while ensuring continuous business operations. The focus is often on that confidentiality, which is focused on authentication and authorization, which we'll touch base here. ZTA encompasses products and controls that need to be in place to deliver high quality and dependable solutions. Only a small set of technology companies can deliver against the expectations of zero trust as defined by Executive Order 14028, Memorandum 2209, or 2131, and I have a slide on that very specifically. And zero trust is more than just authentication authorization. So what you're going to see and hear today is going to dovetail onto some of the stuff that Bob Smith previously spoke about relative to Zscaler and the authorization aspect. So there's a multitude of zero trust efforts. In the previous presentation Bob gave, there was a gentleman that asked a question about, with all of this going on. I wasn't going to dive into this in great detail, but at the end of this presentation, I'm going to drop in a PDF. I am actually involved in efforts that have included the White House, DoD, DISAssist, and DHS, very specifically, on creating a framework for controls. I don't want to get in great detail on this other than you can't monitor and measure what you can't audit what you can't monitor and measure. And so one of the problems relative to this initiative of zero trust and zero trust architecture is that 853 alone cannot define every control, because 853 does not take in consideration things like cloud architectures and things like that. So I will drop some information in relative to those efforts, but it is a little bit of the wild, wild west. Everyone's got their own aspirations of what they want zero trust to be. For me, everything's grounded back into 800-207 and the 7 tenets. So as we go through, you'll hear me refer to those quite often. Relative to current thinking versus zero trust principles, current thinking, single authentication users of device are given access to a broad range of resources, number one. And number two, and I've said this for several years, there's this ubiquitous use of deny lists where the current security tools in the industry, and a lot of them at RSA this year, is kind of inherently trust that all activities are legitimate unless known to be malicious. And we have to change that mindset. In order to change that mindset, we have to look at it from a perspective of good, not bad. And when you do that, all the metrics start changing. So relative to zero trust and 800-207 and the 3 basic principles, today I will be kind of focused on principle number 1 and number 2. Never trust, always verify, and assume a breach. And when there's a breach, think of it in the context that a malicious actor is on the network. They can essentially only do one of 2 things. They can snoop around, try to exfiltrate data if they can do that, relative to some of the solutions that Bob spoke about earlier, or they can add, modify, or delete something. That's all they can do. And when you put it in simple terms like that, it starts to simplify what and how we can achieve success in the zero trust initiative here. So zero trust. What's the focus? The focus has, as I mentioned earlier, authentication, authorization, giving the right people the right access, the right resources, the right information at the right time. But what difference does that make if those systems and devices, I call that the workload, that access and identity platforms run on, can't demonstrate that they are trusted or are not available or accessible? So this is one of the reasons for the inclusion of tenet number 5. So the 7 tenets. Tenet 1, it defines everything. It's the governance and definition. Tenet 2, That is the secure communications, which is encryption. Tenet 3 and 4 is authorization. I'll come back to Tenet 5. Tenet 6 is authorization and authentication coupled. And Tenet 7 is the aggregation of data, which are really SIMs, is highlighted in Memorandum 2131. Tenet number 5, the integrity, the enterprise monitors and measures the integrity and security posture of all owned and associated assets. Okay, so what's integrity and what's security posture mean? Well, integrity is the confidence and certainly that appropriate controls and compliance requirements are in place and operating as expectedly. That's probably the most important thing. Not that they're in place, but they're operating as expectedly. And what does security posture mean? The organization's ability to identify and respond to those threats and recover from them. So as we move through this presentation, I'll be able to demonstrate what that means from an integrity perspective. So where does integrity fit in this? Well, it's not under data protection where there's a breach in confidentiality. That's really the authorization side of the equation, like Bob was referring to, Zscaler products. That's where data exfiltration, leakage, extortion, and gain of knowledge really fall into. The focus for integrity assurance is on workload security, where it impacts downtime, ransomware, failed compliance audits, but more importantly, the ability to mitigate creating and propagating new vulnerabilities. So when a vulnerability is out there, it's a horse race to see who gets there first, the good guys or the bad guys. The bad guys get there first. They're going to, again, they can only super and try to exfiltrate data, or they can add, modify, or delete something, which means they're creating and propagating new vulnerabilities. Gartner's perspective on that workload that I'm referring to here. This came out about 2 years ago from Gartner. It was initially called the Cloud Workload Protection Platform. They, in their wisdom, they changed it to the workload protection controls because they determined and understood that it doesn't matter if it's in cloud or on-prem, the same controls apply. So what are the core controls? Everything below the blue line is referred to as the core controls for the workload protection. Relative to integrity, out of those 12 areas or control areas, 5 of them are very, very specific to integrity. Arguably, there's a 6th called vulnerability management. Vulnerability management, in my opinion, is broken out into 2 categories: vulnerabilities you know about or vulnerabilities you don't know about. Vulnerabilities you know about is definitely a multi-billion-dollar industry with the likes of Tenable and Rapid7 and Qualys, as they compile and attest and identify vulnerabilities from a CVE perspective. Vulnerabilities you don't know about require a whole set of other controls to be able to identify and mitigate those risks, and that's where integrity controls come into play. So, tenet number 5, it's very ambiguous. Like I said, if I asked 50 people their definition of integrity, I'm going to give 50 different answers. So really, what is tenet number 5? It is very specific to integrity and the security posture. So got 4 issues. There's no formal integrity definition of control specific to that have been established, not only specific to Zero Trust, but also to other frameworks outside of Zero Trust. And security posture refers to the ability to not only detect, but respond and recover. This has been the biggest problem, is the detection aspect, because we're looking at it from a perspective of bad. We have to flip that model. And if we know everything that's good, everything else is then managed by exception. And then without integrity assurance, you cannot ensure that the workload solutions providing the authorization platforms like Zscaler and others aren't compromised. So tenet number 5 is often overshadowed by the authentication authorization focus of Zero Trust. So what is integrity and security posture? I'll tell you first and foremost what it's not. There's this little acronym out in the industry called File Integrity Monitoring, FIM. I'm one of the original guys at back in the days when I was at Tripwire. We created that acronym. But there is no integrity in the detection of change. It just tells you something changed. So when we hear the word FIM, all I want people to know and understand is a baseline's been established and you're detecting change against that baseline. It doesn't tell you anything more than that other than something changed. So as we go into the understanding of the controls that make up integrity, know that the functionality of integrity crosses multiple domains, multiple compliance mandates, and I'll even show you a couple of graphs that approximately 24% of all best practices and compliance controls are integrity controls and processes. So integrity, it's simply more than the FIM. So when we talk about FIM, it's the detection of change, and very specifically to a file. That's where FIM came from. But when we talk about system integrity assurance, it covers a multitude of things. So where is that line that discriminates between FIM and system integrity assurance? Well, FIM just detects changes against files. When we talk about system integrity assurance, we're talking about more than that. We're talking about files, settings, directives, configurations, users, group ports, database schemas, you name it, LDAP, Active Directory, hypervisors, containers, VMware. You have to look at integrity across the entire infrastructure, not just files. So going back to the original breakdown here, when we look at integrity classification or categories or domains encompasses more than just files. It encompasses process and technology that includes system hardening and benchmarks, so utilization of CIS benchmarks and DISA-STIGs. It includes configuration management, change reconciliation, rollback and remediation, the ability to prevent change. Some things should never be changing. Being able to provide side-by-side comparisons between current state and previous state. File allow listing. This is the old analogy is blacklist approach. File reputation services. So as I mentioned earlier, looking at this from a perspective of good, given that everything that is referred to as file allow listing and file reputation services based on MD5 hash, we might as well digest the bad as well to notate and be able to determine, has a bad file ever existed? Does it exist on a system? Or has it ever existed in the past on the system? To be able to provide forensic analysis and detail if an event has occurred, you can start to know and understand kind of the data elements around that event. And in addition to that, being able to digest sticks and taxi feeds. Part of those sticks and taxi feeds include known bad elements. And when you put all of those control categories or definitions into a workflow and ticketing system, now that's integrity assurance, system integrity assurance. The irony of that is when you put all that together, it's very complementary to compliance and mappings. So what does integrity help solve? It's critical to achieving a zero trust framework, number one. Two, it provides the detail and evidence to assure that your infrastructure is running as expected. And when deviations occur, we call that integrity drift, if the changes occur that are unknown, unwanted, or unexpected. I was sitting in a recent presentation given by the government, and the gentleman stopped in the middle of the presentation and said, look, here's the deal. 80% of you guys are hacked and don't even know it. As you can imagine, everyone in the audience is turning around going, am I in the 80% or the 20%? So in the context of integrity, all security issues start with a change. If a system is hardened, if it is expected and trusted, the only way that that's going to deviate is through change. It's the cornerstone for a resilient infrastructure. And it can minimize the impact of an incident response plan, disaster recovery plan, and business continuity plan. When you look at those two graphs on the side there, these are actually based on real data, real market information. The focus is post-event. And the post-event is when you instigate an IRP, DRP, and BCP. IRP, DRPs, and BCPs aren't they're not made to be instituted or initiated on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. They're there, or they were initially put there in place for purposes of disasters and continuity plans and response plans when problems occurred. The problem is problems are occurring on a daily basis, not on a monthly or weekly basis. So what we need to do is we need to move our focus to the detect side of the left side of the event. In order for us to do that, we have to take in consideration change control, configuration management, baselining into consideration. To give you an analogy of how bad this is a report that came out of the OMB, the Federal Cybersecurity Progress Report, a little over a year ago. The detect element is the problem. When we can move and shift from reactive post-event to pre-event and prepare and know and understand things that are changing in the environment are associated to either authorized change or known, all of the metrics change. So where is the problem stemming from? Well, in the average, the 2023 industry average is this MTTI and MTTC, mean time to identify and contain a breach, is collectively 277 days, 204 days to identify and 73 to contain. This is, in my opinion, pathetic. And to give a kind of a scenario or give an analogy here, I'm going to show you in a couple slides here. Operationally, compared to security, it's night and day. It's apples and oranges, and we have to take a play out of the playbook of operations to meet the objectives of what we're trying to achieve here. Integrity, it's a leading indicator that you have unknown vulnerabilities. When things are changing inside an environment that are unauthorized, it very well is either, it can only be a circumvented process, or it's a malicious actor doing unwanted, unexpected things. It addresses the problem, not the symptom. And my analogy here is ransomware. The symptom is we're all focused on the target data gets encrypted, right? So everything, and then it becomes an IRP, DRP, and BCP activity of how quickly can we restore? When in fact, the problem is the first step is that the software has to be added. So if something changes in that environment and a payload gets added, even before it gets executed, let's stop it there. So again, another function or control of integrity can minimize and mitigate the ransomware element of this. And for those in government, this should ring home very closely. Creates a closed loop process. All military activities are a closed loop process. This should be no different. You establish a hardened system, step one. That's configuration management. Step 2, 3, and 4 have been around for decades. It's the release management. So I'm going to institute and implement a change. Change request goes to a change advisory board, team, or individual. They say, yep, let's go do this. A release plan is created where you design, build, test, schedule, deploy. You open the window, make the changes, close the windows. That's step 2 and 3. Step 2, 3, and 4 have been around for decades, but it's not a closed loop environment. What needs to occur is the back half of this loop where you capture the scheduled and authorized changes, which is step number 5. Step number 6 is those changes need to be identified in real time. But the most important step of this is step number 7. It's the reconciliation. From an operation perspective, we call that curation. Changes that are observed are then reconciled or curated against changes that have been authorized. So if 500 changes have been authorized in that work order and we see 550, what are the 50? The 50 can't only be one of two things, a circumvented process or they're malicious. You keep hearing me come back to those two things. This is how we can actually, we're flipping the model to look at it from a perspective of good versus bad. And then if there is a problem in the world of integrity, specifically Cimtrac and Cimcor here, we store all the files on the baselines and the versioning and history of those baselines. So if we need to roll back to a day, an hour, a day, a week, a month ago, we can do that. But we're not re-provisioning, we're rolling back to baseline. So if a system was, there was a file added to a system, we remove it. If there was something that was removed, we add it back. If something was modified, we restore it with the original. To put this in context, integrity makes up 24% of best practice and compliance requirements. Relative to NIST 853, all the controls that I previously control categories that I described earlier, 27% of 853 are integrity controls. 21% of 171 R3 are integrity controls. FedRAMP, 53% of FedRAMP high core controls are integrity controls. Now, relative to DoD and CISA, as I made mention earlier, everyone's trying to come up with their own kind of framework for zero trust. The primary difference between DoD and CISA is really that DoD takes into consideration orchestration, automation, and visibility and analytics as their own categories, whereas CISA builds those two categories inside the 5 pillars of identified identity, devices, network, workloads, application, and data. Please don't let those 5 or 7 be misconstrued as tenets defined in 800-207. They're very different. So I made mention earlier about RSA. You know, there's 2,500 security companies trying to kind of fit into one of the 6 buckets of 800-207. And I say 6, even though there's 7 tenets here, because tenet number 1 is all about the definition and the governance. So set aside tenet number 1. Tenet number 2 is all about encryption. So when we talk about encryption, we're really talking about, you know, blowfish, two-fish, triple DES, AES, RSA, those kind of encryption algorithms. Tenet number 3 and 4 is authorization. As I mentioned earlier, tenet 5 is integrity. 6 is authentication authorization coupled, and tenet 7 is SIMs. So how many companies actually fit into those 6 tenets? Set aside tenet number 1. It's really simple. Now, recently I was invited, 3 weeks ago, I was invited to the White House to give feedback on 800-207. Tenets 1 through 7 are very, very clean. They're very defined and the architecture inside 800-207. I proposed to the National Institute Cyber Director that there actually should be a tenet number 7. And that tenet 7 should actually include the workflow. It's great to have all 6 of these tenets defining encryption and authentication, authorization, integrity, and SIMs. But if it's not put into a predictable process from a workflow perspective and understood to be incorporated into not just on-prem but also in cloud environments, we're still missing some of the picture here. And I presented this probably about 2 months ago, and everyone keeps asking, "Can I see the 7 tenets again?" So I thought I'm going to bring it up again. So it's not everybody at RSA will fit into zero trust. Please do not get over, bright shiny objects, from RSA and other events. It's a small list of technologies and functionality and those that can meet the core objectives of the definition of the architecture, as well as the proposed controls that'll go with the architecture. So that was part one, phase one of the presentation. Two here is relative to the zero trust industry days and the scenarios that were put forward for Secluded Semiconductor Inc. And there were 7 questions at the end that we were asked to align. And what you're going to see and hear from me today is a couple actual real world scenarios here. So first was, what mitigations would reduce the resulting security, resilience risk, and threats associated with the island infrastructure? So my analogy is going to be the Colonial Pipeline. We all know about what happened. We all know and heard about it in the news. So the attack leveraged ransomware after compromising an unused VPN. So where would integrity fit into this? Monitoring the integrity of Active Directory would have been able to notify admins to disable the account. So that's first part of that. Second part was integrity monitoring would have been able to detect the ransomware payload. As I mentioned earlier, we're focused on the symptom, not the problem. The problem is something got added, or in this case, it was a ransomware, and then it got executed. So how would we have been able to resolve that first part? There's a perfect example. What concerns do legacy systems create? Well, this one's more textbook, right? There's 4 considerations: outdated security protocols. There's a lack of patching and updates. I still can't believe people, still don't do this on a regular basis. Incompatibility with modern security tools. So when we refer to the tools relative to the OT side of the equation, not IT, but OT, we're dealing with PLCs and SCADA devices and things that were not designed to be put on the internet with security considerations. As a side note, our organization, Cimcor, we actually started in the OT side of the equation. And the basic premise in the OT side of the equation, whether it's manufacturing or critical infrastructure, is that when something went down, the first question in consideration is, what changed, right? So again, it drives back to that change element as being one of the, determining what change is the trigger to kick off a process to determine how do I either remediate or mitigate that risk of something that just happened. And number 4, limited visibility and control. Again, these are legacy systems. They don't have the traditional interfaces and APIs to be able to grab this information and control and provide relevant visibility. What challenges, question number 3, what challenges arise from OT and IIoT systems when considering zero trust? So my example here is the Ukraine power grid example. So 250,000 customers in Ukraine were impacted by blackouts, resulted from 2 primary purposes. The attack was executed through installing malware that altered system files. Monitoring the installed software and SCADA devices would have been able to detect unauthorized changes. Furthermore, when those changes were detected and if they were allowed, integrity controls and capabilities would have been able to roll back and remediate those systems immediately, collapsing the 277 days down to literally seconds and minutes. Question number 4. In a highly connected system like a smart city, how do you handle vulnerabilities? Okay, vulnerabilities. As I mentioned earlier, vulnerabilities, from my perspective, come in 2 flavors: known and unknown. Known vulnerabilities are cataloged and described as the CVEs, the common vulnerabilities and exposures. And this is very closely tied and associated with best practice of patch management. This has been around for decades. Being that it's been around for decades and our problems are getting worse, this is basic good hygiene, but this is not what's going to solve the problem. Being able to identify the unknown vulnerabilities, on the other hand, requires integrity controls and processes. And being able to detect the unauthorized changes is a leading indicator that you have a vulnerability or a supply chain problem. Threats. All security issues start with a change. So when I say this, I'm referring to the workload layer, where changes derive from either circumvented processes or changes that are the result of malicious actors. Integrity controls provide those controls and processes to ensure and provide the assurances that the systems, devices, applications are in a known and trusted state. Now, again, I made reference to earlier what FIM is, file integrity monitoring. When we talk about integrity assurance, we're not just talking about files, settings, directories, configurations, containers, VM, hypervisors, but we're also talking about supported platforms. Everything from Windows, Linux, Sun Solaris, Mac, HPUX, AIX, even network devices, Cisco, Checkpoint, Extreme, F5, all the way out, as well as databases, hypervisors, cloud platforms, whether it's Google, Amazon, AWS, Azure, as well as containers, Dockers, Kubernetes. So we have to look at this across the entire spectrum, not just in a single sliver. So how does Zero Trust help address the accessibility and availability required of a manufacturing environment? So when I read those two words, I think of operations, because I came from the IT service management side of the equation years before being in security. And the best analogy I can give is that when you look at ops versus security, well, first and foremost, ops and security, they don't go to lunch together and they don't go to the same parties or do anything together. It's an us versus them. And this has to change. Because when we look at the best practices of ops and security, there is tremendous overlap. Relative to integrity controls, there's almost an 85% overlap. But here's the problem. When we look at the problem in security, everything's measured in months. 277 days is the ability to identify and contain a security breach. Relative to ops, their acronym is MTTD and MTTR, mean time to detect and mean time to recover. The ability to detect and recover, their industry average is 90 minutes. So what's the difference? I was interviewed at RSA on this very topic of ops versus security. And my response, first and foremost, has everything to do with process. Security lacks the process of all the control domains and the control categories and the controls themselves. They're just out there, and everyone's expected to meet those controls without any process. Question number 6 for the scenario is, what factors must be considered when managing disasters? Well, first, I look at the world from two perspectives again. It's natural disasters versus cyber disasters. So natural disasters, where does integrity come into play? It really comes into play on 2 of the 8 categories of backup and recovery, communication, and collaboration tools. Relative to cyber disaster, half of cyber disaster control considerations include integrity. That's continuously monitoring, having redundancy and resiliency built into the infrastructure, incident response planning, and collaboration and coordination. And then last but not least, in the event of a loss of connectivity with cloud services, how do you manage identity access? Well, I'm going to leave this one up to the authentication and authorization guys like Bob and others to answer this one. So that completes. Well, I got two more slides. Little self-serving slide here, which is relative to Cimtrack, our product. This is what it looks like in all of the infrastructure that we support. Relative to the description that everyone previous to me has presented today is this is not, there's no one technology that can meet the objective of zero trust and zero trust architecture. Given that, it doesn't mean that everyone in the world or everyone at RSA is going to be able to align with ZT and ZTA. There is a small stack in that slide that I presented of the 6 of the 7 tenants. We're following that as a roadmap for integrations into authentication, authorization, Cimcor for tenant number 7, third-party ticketing systems, which are the foundation, which I believe should be a tenant number 8, and the integration of integrity services into file reputation services, threat intelligence, and considering where all this runs, if it's in the cloud, utilizing cloud considerations. So third phase of my presentation here, I'm going to put it in real world context. So there's a reason Bob went before me. I asked that he present first so that we can tie the stories a little bit together. This is not exclusive either to Zscaler or to Cimcor, but over the past 6 months, we have completed a number of integrations. We're on count, I think, 6 right now. And it's the purpose of the integration is to tie integrity into the zero trust strategy and a methodology that Zscaler is rolling out. And so, as you can see here, there's 6 different integrations. I am able to provide a couple of these integrations demos, and they're quick 1, 2, 3 minute snippets that shows exactly what is being done relative to the combination of Cimtrack and Zscaler, where 1 + 1 = 3 or 4. The first is continuous authority to operate of systems utilizing benchmark and audit score triggers. So these are just quick links to Loom. And I will give 3 or 4 of these, and then my presentation will be complete here. So please let me know if you guys can't hear this. I had problems with Loom earlier here.
But doesn't have the ability to have the user trigger a Zscaler isolation policy on or off based on the score of some benchmark or mapping within Cimtrack's compliance module. When a user sets up a scan, they're usually going to be choosing a particular audit they're preparing for, which maps back to a particular benchmark or a CIS benchmark, the security or auditing of that system. So if either a benchmark or an audit mapping fails, this can kick off the isolation policy. Now, this is configurable by the threshold of the score. So that's the trigger right now. Enable the isolation policy if the pass threshold is not met. In other words, if it's not 100% score, which is the default, but a user might have a threshold of 80%, for example, in which case, if it doesn't pass 80 or higher, it will kick off that isolation policy. We're going to kick off the scan now at 4C. We're going to come back and see that the scan has started. I do not expect the scan to pass, so we should see it fail pick up. And right after, we're going to see the isolation policy get turned on. Okay, so the scan has completed and refreshed here. It turns out I am not passing any of the mappings or benchmarks. And we see the message that it has gone on and enabled the isolation policy. Coming back and refresh, we'll see it has been turned on. And then again, when we go refresh book, it's now locked down. this integration, the user has some options. They can either A, manually go check out the system, investigate, see what happened, review it, scan it, clean it, and then manually disable the policy. The repository, or coming soon, the user will have the ability to choose to have this be turned off upon the next passing score we get. Maybe the scan comes through, everyone gets these alerts that a failure to wear an isolation mode is turned on. They now make their changes to harden the system. The next scan comes back as 100%, in which case we can automate the ability to unlock or disable that isolation policy because the score has now met the user threshold. This is another powerful way to track the integrity of systems.
So that's one example. The next example that a demo that I'll give is another continuous authority to operate a system utilizing integrity triggers.
This is a demo of Cimcor's new integration with Zscaler's isolation policy. Once the two systems are connected, the user now has the ability to add triggers to enable that isolation policy in question. With a quick example, here for this phone drive setup, we have 3 triggers to enable that of their choice. There. The 3 triggers explained are: if some unreconciled or unknown change was to occur in this directory, enable the isolation policy. Or another option is that a file that was found in Cimcor's deny list in this directory will enable the isolation policy. And lastly, if the file is not in the allow list, enable the policy. It's a frequent way you can trigger this depending on the level of security or the scenario. Now, I already have this set up on our Windows operating system monitoring policy, which is monitoring the Windows folder, exclusions, really just focusing in on the important TLLs, EXEs, files, and other items. There has not been any changes since I've enabled this policy last, and I have this configured with a trigger not an allow list. Therefore, any file that gets added that is not in my trusted allow list will trigger the isolation policy or Splunk, which is currently disabled. So now we'll go into the system and let's open up the host file. Here I'll add an entry as an example.
Did the audio just cut off? I can't hear the audio anymore. Oh, there it goes.
Coming back to the console upon a refresh, we will see the change has been detected by Cimcor. Coming up, Cimcor will now enable the isolation policy for this system. Just refresh, and here we can see the message from Cimcor that we did enable the isolation policy called browser isolation Splunk. Going back to Zscaler upon a refresh, we will now see that this has been turned on. But now if we go and try to access Splunk, we can now see it's an isolation mode. Nothing can be changed. Nothing can be typed. And in the background we can see the one. Now these same messages can get sent out to email, syslog, SNMP, where once the user gets this message, they may go investigate the system, clean it up, run some scans, what they gotta do to get back to a known good state. Once that's done, the user does have the ability to come in on the Cimcor side and disable that policy. So from here, we send the disabled, we'll go back to the Zscaler side and see that it wants to refresh, and there it goes.
So that's demo number 2, and we do have other demos that are very specific to Cimcheck and Zscaler. But what I thought I would do is show one very specific to, as Justin made reference to in the last demo, the ability to roll back and prevent changes. So when changes occur, we can log changes, but the next little quick demo I'm going to show is Cimcheck being able to identify those changes and being able to not only prevent them but also roll back here. So, and then this will end my presentation and open for Q&A here. So this will give you context of integrity and its functionality beyond just detecting change.
Which will still log the change. What's different in that baseline that's taken is not only do we hash the files, we also take a copy of them and store them in the master repository server in an encrypted and compressed format. Also, as changes take place, we take incremental snapshots as these changes occur. So here again, I can delete and now let's modify this configuration file. Maybe removing some lines. Adding a new spooky virus that may consist of 8 lines. Changing the address. Control S to save. We'll come back to the console. All of these changes are found in the change log for this monitoring policy. Again, the deletes, the adds, the modifiers down here. Same information, but who, the what, the when, the where. But now, this change I made with Notepad, passing in this mode, we're storing the content. Now I can compare against the previous state. See what changed in the file, side by side, line by line. Things in blue have been modified, green has been added, and red has been removed. This is full comparison available as well, or getting right down to the exact changes line by line to get around them. And the file attributes can listed here at the bottom too. Maybe it's the size, the hash, read or write only, the hidden and the archive file. Any of these things change, you'll get notified. The next step is restore mode, which will restore any change automatically, self-healing the directory back to my baseline. I delete these files. Cimcor can recognize that they're gone. It puts them right back where they belong automatically. In fact, the files I deleted are still here in those cycles. It's an actual transfer from the master repo in real time. I made a new file, maybe it's a virus or something bad. Cimcheck sees it doesn't belong, takes it right out. Modify a file. Delete all text. Control S to save. Timestamp and size change. There we go, back to normal. And log now we'll see those things I tried to delete, except they're replaced with the repository. Also, they added and removed. I could download these for investigation, or maybe analyze them right here using one of the free file mutation services that we can integrate to learn if it's a threat, whether it be Google Virus Tunnel, Mountain Wildfire, or Checkpoint Threat Cloud. Here I can see Virus Tunnel showing me that all these antiviruses should think this file is safe. If it was bad, we could add that to our blacklist to see if it was added to any of our systems in the future, or if it's been on our systems in the past, based on the history we have saved. Lastly, deny access mode. Stop separation before it occurs. Try to delete these. It's not going to work. Even though I'm an admin, I cannot make these changes go through. I can't add, I can't delete, I can't modify anything. It's completely locked down. And again, I go back, I will see here, all those add deletes I just tried, they were prevented from occurring. The same information we had before, the who, the what, the when, the where. You can mix and match these modes anywhere you like. One mode on one folder, another mode on one or two files. It's up to you. You can even mix and match them on the same item. Here, based on a file action, maybe if it's added, you want to log the change, just want to know. Maybe if the file change.
So there we go. In the PDF that I had shot over to everyone here, they'll be able to click these hyperlinks to go see these demos, either demos of integrity through Cimtrack or demos and relative to the integrations between us and Zscaler. So more are coming in the very near future. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending and listening. If there's any questions, I'm open for Q&A.
So thank you, Mark. I would like to keep us on time. There are 4 questions. So anything that we don't have time to answer verbally, Mark, would you be willing to answer in the Q&A online, the ones we don't get through?
Absolutely. I'll go through these and start answering these. And I am going to add, as I made reference to earlier, the efforts of myself and a few others, auditors. Propose, here we go, add this. So I just added the ZT controls that I'd made reference to earlier. So after we're done here, I'll go through all these and start answering questions.